hurricanes are a fact of life in Florida. But in Sanford, some of these massive storms seem to have a supernatural path.
On the day that they began dumping dirt on top of the graves, Florida was hit with one of the worst hurricanes in generations.
Because when you disturb the graves of Sanford's original settlers, legend says there's hell to pay.
I was paralyzed with fear.
My heart was pounding a mile a minute. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. There was this big sense of, oh my God, what was that?
And when hurricane season hits the I-4 dead zone, locals know to tread lightly.
It was called Deadly Donna. Hurricane Donna makes a turn and rolled its way right over top of the Field of the Dead.
But on this stretch of haunted highway, hurricanes aren't the only deadly force, and cars aren't the only things that go bump in the night.
Some of the drivers have reported apparitions. They see a ghostly mist, and they get into an accident.
I knew we were in for trouble. Some sort of a ghostly revenge, payback time.
In Sanford, Florida, there's a quarter-mile stretch of highway at the base of the St. Johns River Bridge that's at the heart of a local legend. And it's a legend that has everyone in town talking.
Before I-4 was built, the land was called the Field of the Dead. My whole family knows about the legend. I refuse to drive through the dead zone. I will go out of my way to avoid it. You could not pay me enough money.
I did not realize that there was grave sites under I-4 there until I did a little research, and I guess I'm kind of glad that we're in the water as opposed to driving across there.
While locals may steer clear of this haunted highway, Tony Santiago, a Chicago native, has made the trek through the I-4 dead zone dozens of times without incident, until one night in July of 1996.
We used to go to Orlando and have our family vacation, and I just always loved it year after year. So when I was 18, as soon as I could, I went to Orlando.
Hi, guys.
Tony, happy birthday. Drive safe, okay?
Thank you. Thank you. All right, take care.
So I was working at one of the theme parks out there, and I got off late and decided to go straight from work to Ormond Beach, which is just north of Daytona Beach. I-4 is like the main vein in Central Florida. It takes you, from the West Coast to the East Coast and through Orlando. I drove the I-4 all the time. I was excited. I had the top down of my convertible, had my radio turned up high. I was done with work, and I was ready for a good time.
Big things are going down tonight.
I was about halfway out there in Sanford, Seminole County, and it was kind of foggy and misty, but nothing too bad. There was not one other car except for me. I remember I was listening to the radio, and it just went out. All of a sudden, I see this flash cross in front of my car. It was a small, glowing figure, and it moved like a child. It happened so fast, I just knew there was something in front of my car. And before I could even react to that, I saw a second figure. But this one had more features. I saw arms stretched out, and it was definitely a woman's face. She was looking right at me as if pleading not to hit my child. So I freaked out. I remember hearing my tires screech, swerving over, making sure that I didn't hit them. My heart was pounding. I was a mile a minute. I pulled over. When I got out of the car, there was nothing there. These figures were gone, vanished. I was relieved that I didn't actually hit someone, but then it was just, what was that? I know there was something there. Where did it go? I was never a believer in this sort of thing. And then when this happened, it changed my mind. And I absolutely believe that the dead zone exists. Yes.
Tony is in good company. The I-4 Dead Zone legend has been passed down for generations and has continued to gather believers with each new mysterious ghost sighting.
With a lot of supernatural legends, ghosts emerge for one of two reasons. Either there was a sort of a tragic death and the spirit doesn't leave. The other is that there's some sort of unfinished business, whether it's revenge or something else.
And the ghosts that call the I-4 Dead Zone home seem to emerge for both revenge and unfinished business. It's a deadly combination on this haunted highway. But before I-4 was a bustling interstate, it was a rich subtropical swampland as far as the eye could see. As a meteorologist in Orlando, Tom Sorrells knows Florida's unique climate better than most.
I think when people outside of Florida think of us, they think of the ocean, roaring waves, or beautiful pastel skies. Most of Florida is swampy or lakey. You can't hit a golf ball here without either hitting a swamp or a lake. You have to remember that until about the mid-1850s, no one lived here much. It wasn't very hospitable. It was never thought to be a place you'd want to be because so hot, so much dangerous weather. It's the most humid spot in America. And so you get the heat and the humidity. You get a heat index of about 115 degrees on some days.
And it is within this hot and humid marshy swampland that a legend took shape.
At the end of this bridge, just before you get to the railroad overpass, is where the graves are located, in the eastbound lane of the interstate.
A legend buried beneath the highway that haunts Central Florida to this day.
On the day that they began dumping dirt on top of the graves, Florida was hit with one of the worst hurricanes in generations. Coincidence, or did it have something to do with the graves that were not removed?
In the heart of the Sunshine State lies the sleepy lakefront town of Sanford, Florida. But there's a cursed stretch of highway at the base of Sanford's St. Johns River Bridge, known as the I-4 Dead Zone, where locals believe a legend was born.
What's not to love about a legend? I mean, local legends are great. It's part of the local color. I never really had much trouble myself going down that road until the one time my husband and I were going over the river, and then all of a sudden we felt our car shakes, and it was after that where I was like, well, maybe there is something a little to the stories that happen out on I-4.
But in the mid-1800s, long before there were any highways, Florida was a mysterious, tropical, and largely undeveloped peninsula full of swampland and suffocating heat.
Everybody knows Florida's called the Sunshine State. But we get a lot of storms, too. And I'm talking fresh water from the sky. Thunderstorms every afternoon for about 6 to 7 months out of the year. So you get the humidity, you get a heat index, which feels like maybe 105 to 110.
Despite the unwelcoming climate and terrain, a few brave visionaries make their way to Central Florida's riverfront communities. Rachel Wentz, historian and bioarchaeologist, has been studying these communities and Florida's colorful past for decades.
Prior to there being interstates like I-4 and 95, people really couldn't traverse much of Florida.
But in 1885, the town's namesake, Henry Sanford, sees beyond the swampland. He sees a gateway city to South Florida.
Henry Sanford had a vision of what Sanford could be. He saw the city of Sanford as a hub. We have St. John's River, which is the largest river in Florida, which provided easy access in and out of Sanford, and of course easy access of people and goods as well.
Henry Sanford purchases 12,000 acres on the shores of Lake Monroe and turns to the church for help recruiting tenants.
Henry Sanford enlisted the Catholic priests to help establish Catholic churches, and they developed a small brochure that basically boasted on Florida's natural resources. Henry Sanford knew it would be a prime location for the movement of goods and people.
The campaign works, and a handful of German immigrant families make their way to Sanford to set up a small religious farming colony. But for these early settlers, the challenge of turning swampland into farmland is considerably more difficult than anyone anticipates.
It's hard to imagine how bad it was in the mid-1800s. Back in those days, you had to work your way through what really was a jungle. It's not like a forest up north. It was still humid. It would never cool down. Overnight lows on most nights, even in the wintertime, 60s, 50s, not enough to ever truly dry it out.
The heat and humidity might be hard on the early settlers, but it's perfect conditions for something else.
No matter where you go, the water is still. The St. John's River hardly moves, just a slow, creeping little river, perfect for mosquito breeding.
The settlers hope that Florida's weather will help them prosper, but in the end, it leads to their demise.
There was some bad luck and bad timing involved in the colony because it happened at a time when yellow fever, which is caused by mosquitoes, made its way throughout the state.
And unfortunately for the settlers, yellow fever has their fledgling community in its sights. As the grandson of a Sanford farmer, Charlie Carlson knows the struggles faced in the fields all too well. He grew up in the shadow of this would-be religious farming colony.
Only 4 German immigrant families ever arrived to settle there. And right after they arrived, a yellow fever broke out and took the lives of one family. Man, wife, 2 children. When this family died, that was enough to just send the whole community into a panic. They quickly took these bodies and put them into the ground, and they put up 4 markers. And then they got out of there because they were so afraid that they would also come down with the fever.
Sanford at one point was under quarantine. No one could go out or come in because they thought people with yellow fever could spread it to other people. So cities throughout Florida experienced these very strict quarantines.
Yellow fever put an end to many dreams in 1887.
Henry Sanford's colony never became what Henry Sanford envisioned.
The 4 unmarked graves, a father, mother, and 2 children, remain undisturbed in the overgrown field for 18 years, until Albert Hawkins, Charlie's grandfather, purchases the land in 1905.
When my grandfather bought this property, his intentions were to clear the land for farming.
Albert Hawkins respects the gravesite and takes care to fence in the sacred ground.
My grandfather said, we've got to take care of these graves because they're somebody's resting place.
The field became known as the Field of the Dead because it contained this small little family plot.
But not everyone takes Hawkins' request to heart. And those who don't will pay a price, a deadly price, that will soon take Florida by storm.
As soon as construction started, I knew we were in for trouble.
Weather events bring people together in their shared experiences. Legends, just like the weather, help to shape a community's identity. And in Sanford, Florida, a small stretch of highway known as the I-4 Dead Zone does both.
The I-4 Dead Zone is something that I've known about it since I was a kid. I have had several things happen to me personally. I do believe there's something very strange about the area.
And most folks around Sanford believe the I-4 Dead Zone legend dates back to the deaths of a family of German immigrants buried within the Field of the Dead.
German immigrant families arrived to settle there. And right after they arrived, yellow fever broke out and took the lives of one family. And this colony just kind of fell apart.
And over the next 18 years, Sanford's failed colony is all but forgotten until a new crop of farmers come to town.
The land that was targeted for Henry Sanford's colony was eventually bought up by private landowners. Then a man named Mr. Albert Hawkins.
When my grandfather, Albert Hawkins, came up on these 4 graves, he gave respect to the little cemetery and always farmed around that area. We were always told as children, don't disturb the graves. Be respectful of them. We always took care of them. Everybody respected it as the Field of the Dead.
To the local farmers, the name Field of the Dead sticks, and most heed Hawkins' advice. But when one young boy doesn't, a legend is born.
According to the legend, Hardy was an adventurous boy, and one day he decided to play around the graveyard there in the middle of the field.
Don't do it, Hardy!
I can recall my grandmother telling us, don't mess with the graves. Well, sometimes boys won't heed warnings. The very next day, Hardy had walked up to the store, and on his way out of nowhere comes a car and strikes him down and leaves his body laying mangled in the road. He was playing in that field the day before he died. Rumors began circulating that perhaps those graves were somehow involved with his death, considering that he was struck down 50 yards from the graves.
For the people of this small community, Hardy's tragic death is a haunting reminder not to mess with the Field of the Dead.
This very day, nobody knows who ran over Hardy Jackson Hodge. That mystery is unsolved.
As Hardy's story transforms into local folklore, the rest of Florida is undergoing a transformation of a very different kind.
In the 1950s and 60s, Florida was well on its way to becoming a top destination for tourists. And the more theme parks that were built, the more people wanted to come in.
People were still coming here to experience the warmth and the beaches and the sunshine. They were just coming in much larger numbers because of the growth of the interstate system.
And one new proposed highway in particular will bring much more than tourists to town. Bill Belleville is an author and documentarian whose expertise is the St. Johns River history and environment.
Interstate 4 was built to really help create a corridor in the interior of Florida. So it goes from between Tampa to the northeast to Daytona. It'll connect the coast and open up the interior, cutting through the middle of the state.
But the planned route for Interstate 4 cuts right through the Field of the Dead, and Florida invokes eminent domain to buy up the Hawkins property.
This is a grave. You must not disturb this at all. Very sorry. We've dealt with this before.
My grandparents made sure that the government knew that there was a cemetery there.
It must be fenced in at all times.
But the government doesn't listen and proceeds with their plans to plow over the Field of the Dead. And legend has it, on the very day construction begins, a deadly storm changes direction and treks right over the disturbed graves, leaving locals to wonder, could this new highway mean destruction for Sanford?
Hurricane Donna marched its way right over top of the Field of the Dead.
Residents of Sanford, Florida, have speculated for years about the I-4 dead zone. It's a legend with roots in the town's history and a family of settlers who died in 1887. It seems their graves have a habit of harming those who dare to disturb the sacred ground.
Every town has legends. The I-4 dead zone legend is something that's been coming up in the last couple of years, more and more, since we're redoing the interstate. And rumor has it weird weather patterns always seem to happen around the bridge and that stretch of I-4.
And no one knows this legend better than Charlie Carlson. His grandfather warned the state of Florida not to disturb the graves, but they had plans of their own.
The graves were located right in the middle of the surveyed path for Interstate 4. They felt that these are just some old bones here, and why let that hold up progress?
It would be a decision that they would soon regret. According to legend, on the very day the contractors break ground on the Field of the Dead, a massive hurricane suddenly veers off its predicted course and heads directly on a path towards the graves.
If you look at the track of Hurricane Donna, it's coming past Cuba, almost going northwest. Then just past the northern tip of Cuba, upper level currents turned and made that thing switch. Instead of going northwest into the Gulf of Mexico, it started that march right over Orlando, right through Sanford, right over top of the Field of the Dead.
Hurricanes are nothing new in the state of Florida.
More hurricanes happen in Florida than any other state because of our exposure. We have more than 1,200 miles of coastline exposed to either the Gulf of Mexico, rich tropical breeding ground, or the Atlantic Ocean, rich tropical breeding ground.
But Hurricane Donna is one for the record books.
Hurricane Donna is a very special hurricane in history. Normally when hurricanes make landfall, they cut their power in half for about every 6 hours they're over land. Well, Donna just kept right on trucking. Instead of going way out to the Atlantic, it hugged the East Coast and produced hurricane-force winds in excess of 125 miles per hour, all the way up the Atlantic seaboard into the New England states and beyond. The devastation from Donna was widespread. It was called Deadly Donna. It killed more than 50 people and hospitalized more than 100.
Many in Sanford can't help but see a link between Donna's turn and the Field of the Dead.
On the day that they began dumping dirt on top of the graves, Florida was hit with one of the worst hurricanes in generations. Coincidence, or did it have something to do with the graves that were not removed?
Construction is delayed for several weeks.
Fields were flooded, crops were destroyed, construction equipment was bogged down on the highway. power lines were down. We were without electricity for at least 14, 15 days. And it took at least a month or two for the construction to resume.
But finally, I-4 opens with much fanfare.
Anytime an interstate is put near or adjacent to your community, I mean, that's big news. So from the West Coast over in Tampa all the way to the East Coast near Daytona Beach, they've celebrated the opening of I-4.
Still, residents of Sanford can't help but wonder, will the graves continue to wreak havoc from beneath the asphalt? It isn't long before they have an answer.
I remember that right after the interstate opened up, there was a driver who lost control of his tractor-trailer truck and jackknifed right at the gravesite. So that it was a big wreck that backed up the interstate. Some of the people in the local area saw that as something that was caused by the graves. It was the beginning of the I-4 dead zone.
And this crash is only just the beginning. As a traffic reporter for News 96.5 in Orlando, Ed Torrance has spent his career focused on the troubles with Interstate 4.
I-4 westbound slowing up from just after 434 to after 436. Eastbound delays. The road I report on more than any other is I-4. Reckon I-4 westbound got the right lane blocked in that area. In terms of fatal accidents per mile, I-4 is one of the deadliest expressways in the country. And a crash now on I-4 eastbound at 535. I don't know that I necessarily believe in curses, but I wouldn't rule out the fact that there might be something to this I-4 dead zone legend.
And there are plenty of stories and theories to fuel speculation.
Some of the drivers have reported apparitions in that area. They see a ghostly mist, and it's enough to distract them. And they kind of freak out, and then we get into an accident because they're shocked by what they're seeing.
According to the legend, all of these things are caused by the graves being there. It's like the nameless immigrants in those graves are not taking the disruption of their rest laying down. Be respectful of what's underneath the asphalt because you're driving over the dead.
Many believe the graves are somehow causing these accidents. And Florida native Susie Thompson has had her own run-in with this supernatural stretch of highway.
I lived in Orlando in the 1990s, and at that time I never heard of the I-4 dead zone or the field of the dead. I had driven I-4 hundreds of times, and nothing had ever happened to me until that one day. I'll never forget it. It was July 28, 1994. It was a beautiful day, so I escaped to Daytona to go visit my girlfriend. But honestly, I hated making that drive. It made me a little bit nervous, and I never knew why. I started approaching the bridge. That feeling started to come over me. I was clutching the steering wheel, and then I heard this loud hissing. My car started sputtering. And I was just praying I could pull off safely on the shoulder. And the car just died. I was by myself and I was in a panic. But it was more than the panic of when your car breaks down. I just didn't like being there. It was 110 degrees, and I knew the walk from where I broke down to the next exit was a pretty long trek. I started walking to the next exit, and you have to walk close to the road. People are honking, they're flipping me as a bird. I was a nervous wreck. But then this big truck comes whizzing by. He pulls over on the shoulder. Susan? This truck driver, he says, Susan, just come to me. And he held his hand out. At that time, it didn't even register in my brain that he knew my name. That didn't come till later. I'm just going with this, and I don't take rides from anyone. It was just very unusual. He wasn't anything to be afraid of. I remember climbing in the cab, and it just felt so good. Air conditioning in the truck. And the truck is meticulous. He was meticulous too. And we got off the next exit, and there was a gas station. So I turned to the truck driver, and I said to him, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I got out.
But what happens next will send Susie reeling. According to legend, buried beneath the quarter-mile stretch of Florida's I-4 are the graves of settlers who are haunting this section of highway.
I've heard about the I-4 dead zone legend a couple times. A story I've heard is some dead settlers buried on one side of the bridge, and they bulldozed over it. People say that they never moved the bodies, so now the settler ghosts are angry and walk around on the highway and make people crash. But anything's possible, I guess.
This short span of highway is known for a tremendous number of accidents. Local people blame it on graves being disturbed when they built the highway. It was supposed to be removed, and they just dumped the dirt right on top. Perhaps it's some sort of a ghostly revenge, payback time.
And on a 100-degree day in July of 1994, Florida resident Susie Thompson finds herself in the thick of it when her car dies on the cursed stretch of highway.
After I started walking, my biggest fear now was the heat. It was the end of July in Florida, and it was moldering. All of a sudden, this huge 18-wheeler pulls over.
Susan.
And this truck driver, he asked if I wanted a lift to the nearest exit.
Hop on in.
I was pretty shaken, and normally I wouldn't take a ride from anyone, but for some reason, I trusted him. So I climbed up into the truck. At the next exit, we pulled off, and the gas station was right there. I got out of the truck, and we waved to each other. I took a few more steps, and there was silence.
Susie is lucky. Most stories from the I-4 dead zone don't have a happy ending. And whether people believe in the legend or not, it seems everyone has something to say about that stretch of I-4.
I've heard about the I-4 dead zone, and I've just heard nothing but traffic accidents. Going into that area, it's a horrible pipe bridge going over the river, and it just seems to be a lot of chaos and confusion around there.
So in 2004, when construction is set to disrupt the graves once again, residents who believe in the curse prepare for the worst. And that's exactly what legend says is the reason for what happens next.
On August the 13th, 2004, Friday the 13th to be exact, there was a new approach ramp being built right there where the graves were at. As soon as construction started, I knew we were in for trouble. And sure enough, the first hurricane of the season hit the I-4 dead zone.
And this time, it's Hurricane Charlie that comes barreling up the Florida coast, and it plows a deadly path right over top the I-4 dead zone.
So the legend of I-4 is particularly interesting in terms of legends about weather, because the technology says a hurricane is coming and we expect it to follow this particular path, but it actually veers off course and goes directly over this point. And now it's here is added proof to a legend. So science doesn't remove our interest or need for legends. In some cases, it can actually support them.
Hurricane Charlie was a nasty storm. It was one of the worst days of my life. The wind speeds kicked up to more than 125 knots in the matter of 3 hours. It was blowing up. It wasn't getting a lot bigger. It was just getting meaner and faster. People would call it the I-4 hurricane because it followed the I-4 track even closer than Hurricane Donna had. The damage was extensive. Instead of being a huge, widespread area like Donna was, Hurricane Charlie was a little small ball of hate. The eye of that storm was really, really small, so you only had those Category 1 winds in about a 10-mile radius. So as that thing came through Central Florida, most of the damage was in that 10-mile swath. And that 10-mile swath was right along the I-4 corridor. It ended up being the second most expensive hurricane ever. Totals ended up being about $15 billion.
For Sanford locals, Hurricane Charlie is one more chilling link to the I-4 dead zone legend. And the destruction left in Charlie's wake is so massive, it's almost otherworldly.
Now we've got 2 hurricanes, and they both hit during disruption of these graves. That is a little bit more than coincidence, I believe.
According to the I-4 dead zone legend, the graves of a family of settlers buried beneath the interstate in Sanford, Florida, punish those who disturb their resting place. So when construction is set to begin on the I-4 dead zone in August of 2004, residents of Sanford fear the worst.
There was new construction to build an approach ramp onto the interstate, right at where the graves were. People that were aware of the situation with Donna, they said, oh, here we go again.
And for locals, Hurricane Charlie just adds fuel to the I-4 dead zone legend.
Hurricane Charlie is one of the worst hurricanes that I remember because it actually turned. It was going one way and then it turned right up I-4 where nobody expected it to hit. People think that the reason why Hurricane Charlie turned and went straight up I-4 is because of the curse. The people who are buried there are very unhappy and aren't resting peacefully. And they sent the hurricane straight up and it just damaged everything in its path.
Even meteorologist Tom Sorrells can't help but compare this hurricane with that of Hurricane Donna.
Donna went right along what would be the I-4 corridor. 40 years later, here comes Hurricane Charlie. On the night of August 12th, Hurricane Charlie was south of Cuba. Most of the forecast had it coming across Cuba, going a little farther out to the Gulf of Mexico, and then weaving back into the Tampa area. But that's not what happened. The next morning, the storm tore right through the tip of Cuba, and instead of going to the Gulf of Mexico, kind of hooked a little to the right, almost due north and then to the right into Southwest Florida, right over Central Florida, right through Orlando, right over top of Sanford, and the field of death.
Now we've got two hurricanes that hit the same place. And they both hit during the construction that was causing disruption of these graves. That is a little bit more than coincidence, I believe.
Whether people believe the hurricanes are tied to the disturbance of the graves is still a matter of discussion today.
Most legends survive because at the end of the day, we can say, all right, we have some new scientific theories that might explain this, but it doesn't mean it does explain it. And so there's always that piece that says, no, it's still too strange. It still doesn't make sense for why that hurricane veered to the left or veered to the right when hurricanes typically don't do that over this kind of atmospheric pressure or this kind of land.
I really do think that people have always had a tendency to try to explain what can't be explained. A lot of the myths about weather and thoughts about weather occur because people are looking for a cause when really it's just a coincidence. In my scientific mind, any hurricane has more to do with the atmosphere versus what's on the ground.
But on the ground is where the stories are handed down and a town develops its character.
Legends make for a richer telling of history, how we view our culture and the things that frighten us, the things that intrigue us. Sanford has its legends just like any other place. It's part of how people came here, how they survived here. Folklore is an integral part of human culture.
And the I-4 Dead Zone legend is an integral part of Sanford's town history and the lives of the people who call it home.
My roots are there. There's buried history there. It's important that we remember that what we see as asphalt and interstate today, there's a story beneath that, long before there was even any motor cars for an interstate. People like a ghostly legend like this. But beyond that, it's important that we preserve this history, that we continue to carry these people's story forward. They're not to be forgotten. Every time I drive through there, I pay my respects to those founding family members that are buried there who died back in 1887. Knock on wood, it's kept me safe all of these years.